अस्सलाम वालेकुम नाज़रीन, सिंध टेलीविजन न्यूज़ जे पारां मां आहियां जो मेज़बान फयाज़ नाइज। नाज़रीन, रोज़मर्रा जी सियासत ऐं JITs एहतसाब ऐं ॿिया मामला तव्हां रोज़ ॿुधो था पिया, पर अॼोके ॾींहं ते असां हिकिड़े डिफरेंट पंहिंजो मौज़ू ते ॻाल्हाइण लाइ असां पंहिंजो स्टूडियो में दावत ॾिनी आहे लंडन जी रॉयल हॉलोवी यूनिवर्सिटी जी प्रोफेसर हिस्ट्री डिपार्टमेंट जी प्रोफेसर डॉक्टर सारा अंसारी साहिबा सां गॾु असां ॻाल्हाईंदासूं सिंध जे बारे में। डॉक्टर अंसारी साहिबा जेके आहिनि उहे 1980s जे ॾहाके खां वठी सिंध ते कमु कंदियूं रहनि थियूं पियूं। अॼु ॾींहं ते सिंध जे बारे में मुख़्तलिफ़ एस्पेक्ट्स ते कमु कंदियूं रहनि थियूं। अचो त हुन सां गुफ़्तगू अॻिते वधायूं। डॉक्टर सारा अंसारी, वेलकम टू माई शो
Thank you very much.
I am really grateful to you that a scholar like you has given me time to talk with you about Sindh. So my first question will be, what inspired you to work on Sindh?
Well, would you like the academic answer or the honest answer?
I would like to be with the honest answer.
Okay, so in a sense, my heart brought me to Sindh. Yeah? I met my husband. My husband's family are based in this part of the world. He grew up in Sukkur. And so through him, I first encountered Sindh. I first found out about this place, and I wanted to know more about it. So in that sense, I became interested in Sindh for personal reasons. And then after that, I was studying for my master's, and I was studying the Caliphate movement. And in the books I was reading, every now and then there was a small mention of peers in Sindh. And I was thinking, what are these peers? Who are these peers? Why are they so important? But I could find no answers to that question, or those questions. So gradually, I formed my own research project, which was to look at the history.
But at least Dr. Humayun should have given a little bit knowledge to you. And
Yes, but you know, obviously
he was also a urban citizen of Sindh.
Correct, yes.
Where in Sukkur is the urban center of Sindh.
Yes.
So he actually did not knew the very inner in-depth knowledge about the peers and their.
Precisely. Yes, I mean, he could introduce me to the world of Sindh, but he couldn't give me all the answers. So on that basis, I embarked on my, research into the history of this place. So
in 1980s.
80s, mid-80s, yes.
So you have worked a lot, because this is a very huge thesis. Your thesis of a PhD is a huge, more than 100
yes.
100,
I think 100,000 words, probably.
Yes. What is your findings about the peers of Sindh?
Gosh. Probably one of my main findings was how to explain the enduring appeal and influence of these families. In many parts of the world, we find that similar kinds of institutions have withered, have disappeared under the pressures of, modernity and other change. But what was very clear was that in Sindh, during the colonial period and afterwards, peer families in Sindh remained a really important institution and part of life. And so my finding, in a sense, was that what explains this was the readiness of these families to be flexible, to adjust to changing circumstances, to take advantage of changing circumstances. And that's, in large part, why they survived the way they did.
But you have also mentioned their relationship with the British Raj.
Exactly. So that's
does that mean their survival has one reason of their survival was their connectivity with the British Raj?
I think, in a sense, yes, but I have to explain a bit further.
Yes.
The British obviously ruled this country and ruled it with only relatively few officials. So they had to find relationships, they had to find allies, you could say, among locals. And I think what peers, or some peer families, not all peer families, but some found was that they could, in a way, harness themselves or their interests when they saw it to be useful to the British state. Now, that doesn't mean that somehow they were collaborating with the British, but they were using what the British had to offer as a way of, first of all, reinforcing their position and then perhaps expanding their influence. So I think what happened during that 100 years or so of British rule was very important to the survival of peer families here. For those peer families who were willing and able to take advantage of the changing circumstances, which meant maybe going into politics, for example, in a different kind of way to the way that they might have engaged in political issues in the past.
How do you study their impact on the common people of Sindh?
Yeah. The impact of the peers.
Yes.
I suppose, this is always a challenge for historians. How do you get away from the elites and look at the experiences of the more common people? Because it's the elites who leave behind the written records, the archival material that we can explore. For the ordinary people, you have to find other ways. So I suppose what I tried to do was to look at the relationship which existed during the time I was there, so in the 80s, and try to imagine how that perhaps was in earlier times. And what I saw when I was traveling around Sindh then was obviously the great devotion on the part of, some of the Murids for their, for their Sajjada Nasheen, for their Pir. And I think that was the same in the British period as well. Although obviously with education, with different kinds of opportunities, there were challenges to that relationship. But you're right, it's hard to say if I captured that side of the relationship well. All I can say is that when we say look, or when I looked at the Caliphate period, you could see there that pressure was coming from below on various peer families to participate because their followers, their murids, wanted them to be involved. If we think of the Pir Pagaros, we think of the Hur, pressure, as well was coming on the peer from below. So sometimes you can see that, that taking place.
Actually, you have been working on this subcontinent, especially about Sindh. It was Congress and Muslim League both supported the Khilafat movement.
Yeah.
So then why peers had an opportunity to grip their roots, to have their strong grip on the society instead of political institutions?
Oh gosh. I suppose at that time, so the Khilafat movement, 1919 to 1924, as you say, it coincided with the non-cooperation movement that Congress was leading. So it was a very rare moment in the history of the subcontinent when, both parties or sets of interests came together. And I think, obviously there was an upswelling, a sort of a big increase in popular support for challenges to British authority. And if we look at what happened in Sindh during that period, we see that the issue of the Khilafat movement divided local peer families. Some were very strong supporters of the authorities and told their followers, not to be involved. But others saw this, maybe it was their own personal preference, but they saw this as an opportunity to push it against British rule. And when the Hijrat took place in 1920, we see, quite large numbers of people going from Sindh, to Afghanistan. We also see other anti-British efforts kind of passing through Sindh. So Sindh was really very important to the politics of that time. How to answer your question, though, is a bit tricky. So I haven't really answered it, but try to sort of give you a sense of the context.
So what do you see the social impact of those peers and shrines and Sufis on Sindhi society?
Okay, the social impact. I think In some cases,
Because you have,
yes.
to remind you, you
Yes.
have written that in Nang Sharif you were sitting on that
Yes.
that stage where the
Dastar
Bandi
Bandi, yes.
was taking place, and
Yes.
there was lot of people sitting in
Yes.
front of you,
Yeah.
but you have witnessed there will be no lady.
Well, only me and one other woman.
Okay.
But, yeah.
So
Mumtaz Ali Rashdi. Yeah.
Mumtaz Ali Rashdi,
Saiba.
the wife of Rashdi Saab.
Ji.
So, social impact of these peers and this
I think
sajjada
that,
machines and all that.
I mean, I think one challenge is that obviously the influence of the peer rests on tradition, doesn't it? And tradition has its good side and it has its bad side in a way. So you could say that perhaps the influence of the peers has been over time, over a long period of time, to perhaps restrict the pace of change in Sindhi society. I remember once talking to one particular peer, and he asked, I was trying to interview him, but he was asking me questions. So one thing he asked me was, what did I think that Sindh needed, moving forward? So I was young and I was naive, perhaps, but I said, what I think Sindh, or people in Sindh really need is education. And he said, no. We don't need education. Education just brings problems, brings challenges. And I think, that's one side of the sort of Piri-Muridi relationship. But on the other hand, I suppose, from a point of view of Sindh's identity, its culture, Sufism, and the institutions that, in a way, are attached to Sufism, has been really important. And so maybe that's given people here a certain kind of confidence, a certain identity, which in this world today is a valuable thing.
So you have recently also have revived that work, and you have written another
Yes.
article that is a way of life rather than an ideology,
Yes.
Sufism and peers and the politics of identity in Sindh.
Yes.
Because in 80s it was, you were new
Yeah.
with Sindh,
Very new, yeah.
but writing now after so long time.
Yes.
So what are your conclusions about all these things?
I suppose for that article, I tried to locate the institution of the peer within a sort of broader discussion about, I suppose, identity politics, in Pakistan today. And we know that from the time of Musharraf, let's say, there were efforts to sort of revive, Sufism as a kind of counterbalance to, more extremist religious politics. And in that context, there's a lot of discussion about Sindh being a land of Sufis, and by that implication, a land of tolerance and peace. So that was my starting point. And at the same time, if we look at reports, for example, from the World Bank, they point to the fact that Sindh, unfortunately, remains the place in Pakistan where there is the greatest disparity in terms of wealth and land ownership and so on. So you have these kind of contradictions, perhaps, in one place. And again, what I was trying to discuss really is that why is it that some peers have become closely associated with identity politics in this place, but other peers have not, and have maybe attached themselves to federal parties, governments, and so forth. And therefore, you can't just say that peers in Sindh are the obvious representatives of this place. Some do, some don't. So it was that kind of discussion that I was undertaking. So I suppose to answer, as I said, your question, I think in 30 years, because it's more than 30 years since I first came, there's been enormous change in Sindh in many physical, material ways. And that, has brought positives and benefits. But I think we also need to understand why certain kinds of institutions, certain kinds of relationships are able to endure, to persist. And I think that's still a sort of a conundrum, that there aren't any easy answers for. I think if there was one easy answer, I think that would probably be misleading.
So you are talking about the change in 30 years, and you say
Yeah.
this is a lot of positivity in that change.
Well, I'm talking about, things like, again, it was so long ago, but I remember when I came to do my research on peers, we traveled everywhere across, the province, from sort of obviously starting in Karachi all the way up to Barchundi Sharif, and we went, from east to west, and we went...
Barchundi is in my district. To whom you met in Barchundi?
Oh, I don't remember the names now. I've got such a bad memory, which is not a good thing for a historian.
Okay.
But so all these different sort of shrines, all the way up one side of the Indus, down the other side of the Indus, and so forth. And I remember the National Highway in those days. It was quite an adventure to travel.
Yes.
And now, obviously, the communications has changed hugely. Those sorts of things, I suppose, I mean by change has happened. People now, they have their phones, their cell phones, they connect. That sense of disconnection has obviously changed hugely. So in that sense, places have changed.
You have written about the politics of 30s and 40s in Sindh.
Oh, yes.
But before, I would like to ask about the politics of 20s in Sindh, because that was about the movement from the separation from the Bombay presidency.
Yes.
How do you see that politics in Sindh?
Yeah.
Before you answer, I think let us have a short break, and then I'll come back to you.
Yes.
Nazir, Dr. Sara Ansari, Professor Dr. Sara Ansari Sahaba, असांजी गुफ्तगू हलंदड़ आहे सिंध जे हवाले सां, सिंध जी तारीख़ ते, सिंध जी सियासत ते, सिंध जे पीरनि ते ऐं उन जे इम्पैक्ट ते हुन काफ़ी घणो कमु कयो आहे. गुफ्तगू जारी रहंदी. स्कॉलर आहिनि पंहिंजो रॉयल हॉलो यूनिवर्सिटी लंडन जूं, उस्ताद आहिनि हिस्ट्री डिपार्टमेंट जूं. हुन सां गुफ्तगू जारी रहंदी. वठूं था वक़्फ़ो, वापसि अचो प्रोग्राम खे अॻिते वधायूं था. असां सां गॾु रहिजो. वेलकम बैक नाज़रीन टू प्रोग्राम जे सिलसिले खे अॻिते वधायूं. गुफ्तगू हलंदड़ आहे सिंध जे हवाले सां, ऐं सिंध जे हवाले सां गुफ्तगू करण लाइ असांजो प्रोग्राम दावत ॾिनी आहे लंडन जी रॉयल हॉलो यूनिवर्सिटी जी प्रोफेसर डॉक्टर सारा अंसारी साहिबा खे, जंहिं सिंध ते काफ़ी 80 जे ॾहाके खां वठी कमु कयो आहे ऐं गुज़िरियल ही जेको 32 सालनि जो जेको आहे, बल्कि जेको दौरु आहे, टे ॾहाकनि खां वधीक, 3 डिकेड्स खां वधीक उन जेको सिंध ते कमु कयो आहे, उन जा मुख़्तलिफ़ जेके एस्पेक्ट्स आहिनि उन ते गुफ्तगू हलंदड़ आहे. छो त उन गुफ्तगू खे अॻिते वधायूं. वेल, डॉक्टर सारा, politics of 20s in Sindh.
Yeah.
How do you see that?
I think it's a really interesting period. It's not studied enough. I think people, in a way, move too quickly over that period. What we see from the early 20th century is that Sindh as a region became increasingly more important to the British. Karachi became the third most important port in British India and exported more wheat than any other port in the whole of the British Empire. So Karachi was pushing its status up and up. So what we see is that local commercial interests, financial interests, business interests, political interests wanted or were starting to talk about Sindh separating from Bombay presidency. In fact, the earliest suggestions for this came from local Hindu commercial interests. But then during the 1920s, it started a little bit earlier, but the Sucker Barrage was being built. And the Sucker Barrage was a huge investment on the part of the British authorities, and was intended to sort of transform, the agricultural performance of this region. So Bombay Presidency, that had put a lot of money into this, didn't want to lose Sindh because they wanted to be able to take the revenues, get the benefit from this. At the same time that this is happening, obviously across India, British India, we see the kind of a growing sort of politics of religion, so communal politics.
Communal politics.
Yeah? And while Sindh was able to keep itself reasonably far from a lot of that, it still entered into the political equation here. And so by the early 1930s, it's actually Sindhi Muslims who are arguing for a separate province on the basis that this was a majority Muslim region. As part of Bombay Presidency, it was felt that the interests of Sindhi Muslims would be forever submerged within that majority Hindu presidency. And so we see a sort of a shift take place, and it's at the round table conferences, which were held in London at the beginning of the 1930s, where the case was being made at the heart of British power for a separate province. So I think the 1920s are a key time where this, in a sense, this flips from being something that was being pushed by, for kind of non-communal reasons, to something that was being associated, linked to the changing kind of shape of communal politics in the subcontinent.
What do you think? It was a nationalist voice of Sindh to be separated from Bombay Presidency, or it was a communal voice from Sindhi Muslims to be separated from the country?
That's a very good question. I think it's a bit of both. I mean, I think that certainly there was a sense of, we are a place, we want to be separate from Bombay. We have a different identity, we have a different culture, we have a different language. So that, in a way, created, the basis of an argument. However, alongside that, there is this awareness of the broader sort of communal politics that's starting to really get a grip on Indian politics more generally. So I wouldn't say that it's communal, but I would say it's sort of influenced by that. But I think first and foremost, it was a demand in a way, for a kind of autonomy within the framework of the British Raj. Yeah.
So what was the role of Hindu members? Because that time, as peers,
Yes.
a lot of peers were in the Sindh Assembly.
Yes.
There was a lot of Hindu
Yes.
who were also were very much powerful in Sindh.
Exactly. And I think that they represented Sindh very, very skillfully, very actively. They helped to, in a way, enhance, I think, Sindh's reputation because of the way that they operated, their politics. They obviously had connections, or at least some of them, with the wider Congress movement, which meant that, 1931, Congress held a very big meeting here in Karachi, just after the whole Bhagat Singh business happened in Lahore. So, in a way, what this connection did was to bring Sindh into the heart of all India politics and bring all India politics into the heart of Sindh. So they played a role there. I think, one of the, I suppose, tensions of that time was that many of the Sindhi Muslim members of the Assembly, well, after 1936, members of the new Assembly, and before then some of the representatives in Bombay, tended to come from landed backgrounds, and the Sindhi Hindus, as we all know, tended to be a more urban community. And so perhaps they also had slightly different priorities. If you are representing an urban area, you're going to have maybe a different set of political priorities to if you're representing a rural constituency.
How do you see, in that particular era, we are talking about 20s, 30s, and 40s.
Yes.
The GM said,
Yeah.
Muslim League politics and the incident of Masjid Manzilga, the very, very darkest incident in the history of Sindh.
Yes.
One of the darkest.
Yeah. No, it's very unfortunate, that episode, because in a way, to my understanding at least, it went against what was the prevalent, longer term, reasonably, positive living side by side between communities. But I think what you could say is that it's, again, part of that bigger sort of shift that was taking place within all India Muslim politics, where religious sites became the place that competition was played out.
Bone of contentions.
Bones of contention, exactly. Yes. So I think that probably the Masjid Manzilga and the way that it divided opinion here did leave a bitter legacy that we see then in the later, well, into the 1940s, reflected in how politics moved then. Yeah.
And what about the Allah Bakhsh Sumro and the Congress politics in Sindh?
Yeah. I mean, Allah Bakhsh Sumro was I think he's an understudied politician, and obviously we don't know what his longer term position would have been on Pakistan because of his murder. But while he was still alive, I think he was a very principled politician. He didn't get, in a sense, sucked into party politics in quite the same way. He kept to a certain path which he believed was the best one for Sindh. So I think if you look at the role that he took, and he actually was probably the politician of that time from Sindh who performed on the national stage. Yeah? He, was very involved in the big meeting that took place in Delhi, where opponents of the Muslim League, in a sense, put their argument forward.
But Barrister Burgadi was also playing the part on the national level.
Yes. But I suppose that Allah Bakhsh Sumro, because of being chief minister, because of his locally important position, he could. Sir
Shahnawaz was also participating on the national level.
Exactly, yes. But for me, at least, I find the story of Allah Bakhsh Sumro to be the most intriguing and the most, I suppose, not surprising, but when you talk about his role to people who don't know much about the history of this region, it usually, it surprises them, and they actually stop and they sort of think, well, oh, maybe we have to think about what was happening in Sindh a little bit differently to what we assumed, because a lot of emphasis is put on the fact that in Sindh, it was in the Sindh Assembly where the first vote, in a sense, in support of Pakistan, moved by G.M. Syed, which is ironic, bearing in mind, his later politics. So there's that idea that somehow Sindh, majority Muslim province, was destined, to follow a certain path. But if we look at Allah Bakhsh Sumro's political career, then we see that it wasn't so simple and straightforward. And history, for me, is all about complicating things. History is not about finding easy answers, black and white solutions. It's actually about making us aware of the complications of the past.
How do you analyze Hur movement at that time? Because some people say it was a freedom movement of Sindh. Some people say it was under the influence of Subhash Chandra Bose. Some people say it was a euphoria of a peer, and he was a lot of it. As a scholar reading about that period of Sindh, how do you analyze Peer Pagado of that time and the Hur movement?
I mean, I think when we try and think about this, we have to recognize that because the Pir Pagara himself, as a younger man, spent time imprisoned elsewhere in India, after the 1930s he was sent, and there he did meet Congress supporters, he did meet nationalists, so he was not, he was very aware of the bigger context. At the same time, however, there are local power struggles that go on. And often what we find is the two come together, and that's what shapes a particular outcome. And so I think this is what I would suggest was happening in Sindh at that time. You know, local power struggles, in a way, became attached to the bigger political context. And as is often the case, contemporaries can see those developments in very different ways. So there was support from, say, Nehru or even Gandhi, once, you know, the Hurs had been rounded up, put into the sort of jails and so forth. They became symbolic of the wider sort of oppression, yeah, of Indians under British rule. However, at a local level, obviously the British found the peer very, you know, quite difficult to handle. I mean, there were some sympathisers within the British administration, but they found his challenging, really, of British authority too dangerous. Because if, let's just to go back to what you asked me earlier on, if those powerful local interests on whom the British depended, in order to manage, yeah, a place, stop cooperating, stop, in a sense, collaborating, then in a way that's like pulling the carpet from under the feet of the British. So the British had to, I think, from their perspective, they had to take strong action. They couldn't countenance this kind of challenge. And so, obviously, in the end, they charged the peer, didn't they, with treason, they executed him, and they clamped down, you know, very hard on his followers.
What do you see the reason that at that time, Peer, he was also in Sindh and
Yes.
his movement was also in Sindh?
Yes,
Allah Baksh Sumro, he was also in Sindh.
yes,
GM Sayed, Ayub Khodo, Rashdi, they were with the Muslim League, they all were in Sindh.
yes,
And in between there was Shahnawaz Bhutto and the
Yes.
Harun family, all
yes.
that. Why
And
there was
Hidayatullah as well.
Yes, Hidayatullah. And Gazdar Saab and so many others.
Precisely, yeah.
Why there was no collaboration and a larger understanding among them about Sindh?
Again, that's a very good question. I mean, when sometimes people talk about Sindhi politics at that time, they emphasize the factionalism, yeah? The fact that there were these, you know, competing groups that didn't seem to be able to form lasting alliances, you know, and perhaps some of that had to do with the fact that Sindh was a new province. You know, you have a new province created, suddenly there's a lot of opportunities produced as a result of that. So the competition for those, in a way, advantages perhaps helped, you know, to create the splits and the divisions and the constant reforming of alliances and allegiances. But yes, you're right, it's sort of, it makes you wonder why at that time there wasn't more unity between the different
Power centers.
Power bases is what I was going to say. And if we were being cynical, we might say it was because, you know, each power base wished to dominate.
Yes.
Yeah. And wasn't prepared to compromise. Although there was quite a lot of, you know, shifting of allegiances, but it was like a fluid a lot of flux taking place at the time.
How do you see the murder of Allah Baksh?
Yeah, I mean, this is still, in a sense, something that people explore, don't they? In a way, who was responsible? Why did it happen? And to be honest, I haven't looked in great depth as to, you know, into that. So I can only go by what others have written about his murder. But it certainly took everybody. I mean, it shocked. You know, the shock waves went from Sindh, you know, through to New Delhi and beyond.
Earlier you were talking about the identity politics regarding the peers.
Yeah.
You were talking about identity in terms of Muslim or Sufi identity, or you were talking about the Sindhi identity?
I was thinking more than about Sindhi identity, really.
More than that?
Yeah, more Sindhi identity than Muslim identity, I suppose. I think even...
You mean to say that peers of Sindh wanted a Sindhi identity.
No, I'm not saying they wanted it, but I say they've become in a way symbolic of that identity.
Whom you are representing? Because
Yeah.
you are talking about GMC or you are talking about something else?
Okay. Well, obviously,
Because on the
yeah.
on the large scale, because these peers have never been the part of the nationalist movement of Sindh.
No. I'm really saying that if we take GM Syed, we know that for him, Sufism was a very important element in Sindhi identity. Yeah? People, when they think about Sufism in Sindh, they often associate it with peer families. Yeah? Rightly or wrongly, these peer families are the sort of, in a way, the physical.
I think let me stop you because we have to wind up the first part of our introduction,
No problem.
Of our conversation, and we will be continuing with that, the Sindhi identity, and then you have also written an article about the Sindhi nationalism. So from this Sindhi identity, we will be moving towards that and so on.
Yeah.
नाज़रीन, प्रोफेसर डॉक्टर सारा अंसारी साहब असां सां गॾु गुफ़्तगू जो सिलसिलो हलंदड़ आहे। ही पहिरियों पोर्शन जेको सिंध जे हवाले सां मुख़्तलिफ़ एस्पेक्ट्स ते असां उन सां ॻाल्हायो, उनजो तव्हां ॾिठो। हिन वक़्तु तव्हांखे प्रोग्राम मोकिलाइण कयूं था पिया, पर हिन जो ॿियो पार्ट जेको आहे जंहिंमें असां सिंधी आइडेंटिटी जी जेका पॉलिटिक्स आहे उनजा रूट्स किथे किथे आहिनि ऐं डॉक्टर सारा अंसारी साहिबा उनखे कीअं थी एनालाइज़ करे, ऐं उनमें जेको ही स्पेशल पर्सपेक्टिव जेको उन्हनि जो आहे त सिंध जा पीर जेके आहिनि उहे सिंधी आइडेंटिटी जे हवाले सां उनजो को रोल आहे उहो बि असां कोशिशि कंदासीं त डॉक्टर साहिबा खां उनजो जेको जेतिरो उनजो जेको व्यू पॉइंट आहे उहो तव्हां ताईं पहुचायूं। अॼोको प्रोग्राम इजाज़त वठूं था, ॿिए हिसे जे लाइ इंतज़ारु कजो ताकी सिंध जे बारे में डॉक्टर सारा अंसारी साहिब जी जेके रीडिंग्स आहिनि उहो ऐं उनजो जेको थॉट्स आहिनि ऐं उनजी जेका स्टडी आहे उहा तव्हां सम्झी सघो। पंहिंजे मेज़बान फयाज़ नाश कंदा इजाज़त सलाह कयो।